We last left off in the story. Joshua gave this final epic speech to the Israelites, telling them, make sure that you obey the covenant. God gave Israel this covenant to live and prosper in peace, and he promised that if they follow all the instructions, they do everything right, then they're going to live and prosper and only have blessings in their life. And the primary purpose of, there's a lot of details to those instructions in God's covenant, but the primary thing is don't worship any other gods. Because as you recall, when we talked about in Genesis, there's these other gods that are basically, they're not the God, they're not the creator God, but they're other spiritual beings that were trying to seduce humanity to worship them instead of the one true God. And so all the other nations, besides Israel, were worshiping these other gods, but Israel was called to only worship the one true God, the creator, the God of all the other gods. And that was the core of their covenant, what set them apart as a holy people to God. And so if they could do that, they would become holy as God is holy, because how worship works and what worship is ultimately, worship is your love. The most passionate, deepest part of your love. And so when you worship something, you become like that thing. You become one with it, in essence, in a spiritual way. When you worship something. So by worshiping God, they would become like him, and then they would be an example to lead all other nations back to God. And that was God's plan, as we talked about. I wanted to give you guys a timeline, since we're getting into other events here, because I know we discuss a lot, but Genesis, with Job, covers a period of about 2,400 years. That's why I broke Genesis into two parts, because there's just a lot of history that's going on there. It's the beginning of humanity and the beginning of Israel. And then in Exodus, about 300 years of total silence pass before the beginning of the book. And the beginning of the book kind of talks about that period where the Israelites grow from that family of only 70 people to 2 million people we talked about. So that happens in about 300 years. And then the main story in Exodus is about 81 years. Covers, and we know that because of Moses' life. Leviticus only covers a month and a half. Numbers covers around 38 years of them wandering in the wilderness. And I know you're like, well, I thought it was 40 years. Well, maybe if you add the rest of the story from Leviticus and Exodus, it's 40. But technically, in Numbers, it's 38 years. And then Deuteronomy covers about a month of Moses there. Joshua, the period where they're conquering the land, coming into the west and settling there, covers about 27 years. And then Joshua gives a speech, like I just said. And then now we're in Judges. And the period of Judges is going to cover 450 years. And what's significant about this period is that before, we had first Moses as the leader of the Israelites as a prophet, and then he passed it to Joshua as the leader of the Israelites as a prophet. And what that means is that they were the voice of God to the people. And so by looking at these men, they could see what God's will was, what did God want them to do. But then after Joshua dies, we have 450 years of mostly silence. There's not really any prophets talked about in the book of Judges. So what do we have left? Well, God, Yahweh, is still the king. But how is his voice coming through the people? Well, the only way it's coming is through the Levites that we talked about at the end of last week, that were set apart among the Israelites to be the example for the Israelites to follow of how to be close to God. And the Levites were scattered throughout every Israelite territory among the 12 tribes. They were the spiritual leaders, or they were supposed to be the spiritual leaders in each community. And I say supposed to be because we're going to see what happens with them in Judges as well. But then you had, not all the time, but these judges. Sorry if some of you can't see this. It's but the judges were these temporary military chiefs that were chosen to save and lead their local regions. Judges were not over the whole land of Israel. They only served the people in each local territory. So remember, there's 12 tribes of Israel. And the 12 tribes come from these 4 different women. Here's their birth order, 1, 2, 3. And I gave information on all that. But each of these tribes, except Levi, had their own territory within their land. And the Levites were scattered throughout all the territories. So they lived in some of Benjamin, they lived in some of Ephraim and Manasseh, because those were Joseph's 2. I know that gets confusing, sorry. They lived in some of Gad, they lived in Dan, they lived all throughout. And Judah. Remember, the Jewish people, ultimately come from Judah. That's where they get their name. We'll talk about that a bit more later. And the Levites were the priests, so they were supposed to lead the people spiritually. But politically, the leadership really was the Sanhedrin, which was basically each community had a Sanhedrin. It was this local council or a congress or senate, maybe if you will, of like 70 elders. And each tribe had their own. So Reuben's tribe had a Sanhedrin in their territory, and Simeon and whatever. And so they're not united at this time in the book of Judges. They're what's called a confederacy. That's what the United States was before it was the United States. It was Confederate States. And so a confederacy, it's not really a unity. It's kind of every man for themselves, but we also were connected in a loose way if we have to be.
Like a military alliance.
It's a military alliance, yeah. It's not one united government. It's each tribe had their own government, basically. So that's where Israelites at right now. That's how their government is for this period of 450 years. And there's basically no central authority. God is supposed to be their central authority, but because they don't listen to Joshua, so what happens at the beginning of Judges, after Joshua's death, the generation that he led died. And then after this, the Israelites start to ally with the Canaanites because they didn't drive out all these other peoples that they were fighting with. And they start intermarrying with them. And they start to love their gods and worship their gods. And they start to do the very thing that Moses and Joshua said, don't do that. They start worshiping these other gods. And so because of this, God allows the Israelites to become weak in the land. And he basically allows them to start being subject to the other powers that are in the land. So, and there's many different ones. The Canaanites, at this point, the land that we call Israel, in this period, I don't even know if you could properly call it Israel because it's kind of still Israel and it's still Canaan at the same time. It's kind of this mesh of just all these different people groups. Something else important to understand about this time is the book of Judges occurs during the historical period known as the Bronze Age collapse. And the Bronze Age collapse was the Dark Ages before the Dark Ages. Most people know about the Dark Ages, like medieval times, with Knights of the Round Table and all that, and the Pope and the Church and all that period that happened recently. But before that, there was the Dark Ages that happened when the Egyptian Empire and the Hittite Empire, all these empires mysteriously collapsed. And there was this power vacuum, and one of the centers of it was in the land that became Israel. It's kind of Canaan right now, it's kind of Israel. So that's when Joshua's conquering the land during this time. But then this other group starts coming in too, called the Philistines. But they're not from here either. They're coming in from basically the Greek islands, because there was an old Greek empire called the Mycenaeans. They collapsed, and now the Greeks are also coming in, but they're not called Greeks, they're the Philistines. And so they're coming in to try to take over the land also. And so they become enemies with Israel during this time as well. So I'm kind of giving you an overview of all this before I go into the details, just so you understand what's happening. But basically, because Israel is worshiping these other gods, God allows their enemies from all the different areas to start becoming more powerful than them and basically forcing them to pay taxes, hurting their people, doing all these things, and the people start suffering. And then they remember, hey, the only God that delivers us out of Egypt, when we were suffering in Egypt, was Yahweh. And so then they cry out to Yahweh, and then he raises up a figure called a judge in a local region, because this happened all throughout the land of Israel in different places. So it wasn't like it happened in the whole land all at once, but it was happening during the same period to greater or lesser degrees in each of the tribes. And so the judges become these temporary military leaders that God lifts up for that generation to lead the people in military victory and bring them back to God, too. That's what the judge is supposed to do. They don't always do that. But it's a very dark time. And that's the summary of the crux of what happens throughout the whole book. When Yahweh hears the people suffering, he has compassion on them, and he gives them the judges when they cry to him for help. Now, before the first judge is listed, it's said that the Israelites were looking for a leader among the tribes after Joshua died. Because Joshua had been like just one man leading all of them, but they're looking for a leader among the tribes now. And initially it says that the tribe of Judah is the tribe that starts leading them. And back in Genesis, it was prophesied that Judah would be the tribe that would lead all the other tribes. And so that happens initially in Judges as well with Caleb. Remember Caleb, who's with Joshua, one of the two faithful spies that gave a good report in the wilderness. And so, but then Caleb dies, and then the first judge comes from Judah. His name is Othniel. So I gave you a chart here on the thing, and you can see there's 14 judges. This is all the judges. They're listed in the Bible. Notice the last two are not in the book of Judges, so I'm not going to touch on them that much right now. But I gave you the passages where they're mentioned, and they are the last of the two judges, but they're not in the book of Judges. But the first judge, of course, is Othniel, and he's Caleb's younger brother from the tribe of Judah. And at this time, God had raised up an enemy for Israel called Aram Naharaim, which is basically a fancy way of saying someone in the region of Mesopotamia, someone to the east, the northeast. And so after this, Othniel helps them triumph. They celebrate, they're faithful to God for a short time, and then they go back to worshiping other gods again. And this is just what happens with every single judge. So every time you see a judge, the same thing happens. First, the people are sinning. They cry out to God for deliverance. So God raises up each new judge. The judge saves them from their enemies. Then they have peace, and they serve God for a short time. And then they go back into sin. So Ehud is the next judge. He's from the tribe of Benjamin. Benjamin also kind of takes a bit of a leadership role. And it's kind of interesting because if you look at a map, I wish I had a map for you guys. Judges is one of those things when I feel like you almost can't have enough charts. So like because it helps. But Benjamin is in the territory of Judah, or they share territory. So Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem, which doesn't, remember, there is no Jerusalem yet. I talked about last week. It's called Jebus right now because Judah started to take some of it, and so did Benjamin. It says Benjamin and Judah started to take it, but then they couldn't drive out the Jebusites, which was the type of Canaanites that were in the land. So it remained Jebus for this time. But Benjamin had owned part of it, and then Judah owned part of it too. So Benjamin also has this leadership role a bit. But Ehud from the tribe of Benjamin, he fights Moab along with this group called Ammon and Amalek. Amalek had giants. They were like super evil. God wanted to wipe the Amalekites from Amalek out completely. But the Ammonites and the Moabites, they were still bad. They served pagan gods, but they have their origin from Lot. Lot and his daughters.
Abraham's
after the story,
cousin?
Lot was Abraham's nephew.
That's right.
Yes. So Moab and Ammon came from them, but they were still Gentiles. They still rejected God, served other gods. So after that, the next judge is Shamgar. We don't know exactly what tribe he is, and some people think he was a Hittite, which is kind of interesting. So the Hittites were in the north of the land of Israel, but their empire collapsed into chaos. So it seems, just from the Bible, that a lot of Hittites came down and started living into this. Israel was kind of a melting pot this time, talking about melting pots in history, like America. So you have all these different peoples coming into this land in the midst of this dark age and this chaos that's happening. And so Uriah was a Hittite, who's in the future a great leader and David's general. But Shamgar, he may have been a Hittite who became an Israelite, converted to serving the one true God, and then led the people in victory against the Philistines. So here's the first time where we see the Philistines as an enemy of the people. it's interesting because in Abraham's time, we see a couple Philistines in the land, but not as much as starting here in Judges. After Shamgar is Deborah. He's from the tribe, Deborah is the only female judge and probably the greatest female leader in the Bible, unless you want to count Esther.
Yeah.
But Esther...
She wasn't really a leader. She was like a queen.
I don't count Esther as much as Deborah, but I'm not going to talk about that now. We'll talk about that when we talk about Esther. So,
you're like, I got a lot to say about
a
Esther.
whole other can of worms, yeah. So go ahead, Mike.
Well, I just wanted to point out, you mentioned that they didn't have a prophet, but that's actually not completely true. Because Deborah was actually a prophetess.
She was a prophetess, yes.
She's the only, isn't she one of the only prophetesses mentioned in the whole Bible?
Yes. Let me amend my statement. Israel did not have a national prophet.
Okay.
So in other words, a prophet that united all 12 of their tribes.
But they did have Deborah.
They did have local spiritual leaders that acted in a prophetic role, such as Deborah. Gideon did as well, who was one of the judges. Usually, if they did have like a prophetic type person, it was a judge. But the important thing, like I said, judges are local leaders. So they're only leading a couple of the tribes, or it's not. Although what Deborah does, she ends up leading, I think, 9 of them or something like that. Deborah leads quite a large portion. And what's interesting about Deborah's day, so she was from the tribe of Ephraim, one of the Joseph tribes, the more significant one, which means she was in northern Israel. But the enemy in that time was just the Canaanites, typical. But in her generation, the men were all just wimps, basically. They just lie down and take it, to put it bluntly. So, even her husband, like the only reason we know what her husband's name was is because, Deborah's husband, because she was his wife. And that's what made him, he's mentioned just one time.
That's what made him famous?
Yeah. And even the military general, because God tells her to go to a guy who's a military general named Barak, and not Obama, but it's spelled like that. And the name honestly might come from that. Probably means blessed. This is Hebrew Barak, but anyway. Point is, there's this guy named Barak. He's a guy, and Deborah God tells Deborah to basically tell him that he's supposed to lead all the people of Israel, all the troops in battle against the Canaanites. But he says, well, I don't want to do it. I don't think we can do it unless you go with us, because we need you. You're the most important father. Even he recognizes her as the greatest. So because of that, she says to him, because you said this, God is going to give the glory to women in this situation. And so there's this other woman named Jael, Jael, not put someone in jail. Something like that. And she ends up being the one, basically the Canaanite general. They have this battle with Deborah and Barak, and they beat the people. And so this Canaanite general is running away from the battlefield. And Jael, he doesn't know that she's with the Israelites. She says, oh, I see you're escaping. You want to come in? I'll give you some milk. And so he goes in there, and she gives him some milk, and then he falls asleep, on her lap, and she might have been, rubbing his, whatever. She's, taking care of him. And then all of a sudden, she, once he's asleep, she takes a tent peg and a hammer and just drives it through his skull.
Game of
literally
Thrones
goes, all the way through. And it's a gnarly story.
They would show that in Game of Thrones.
And then, and then after that, there's this song of celebration because they beat the Canaanites. And in the song, Deborah and Jael are both honored as the most important people of the military at that time. And they're just these random. Well, Deborah wasn't random. Deborah was a prophetess. She was a leader.
Jael was random, but
they were from the streets.
That was a right place, right time.
Right. Yeah. Jael was just some girl.
But she did something.
But she did. Yeah. God used her to kill the general of the Canaanites. Sisera was his name, I believe.
That's pretty cool.
So, anyway, she was from Ephraim. Okay, so after Deborah, we have Gideon. And Gideon was from the tribe of Manasseh, also one of the Joseph tribes over here. Remember, these are the half tribes, so they both count as one tribe, but they're both Joseph, because Levites are not counted. That's why I put -1 here, +1, just so you get 12 tribes. Gets confusing with the
Like
12
Harry
tribes.
Potter. Minus
Anyway.
one from Gryffindor.
And then we have, okay, so actually I need to talk about Abimelech. This is another fun story. So Gideon was fighting the Midianites, and the Midianites also came from Abraham, but they had fallen into serving other gods and were oppressing Israel. And so Gideon leads them in victory against the Midianites. This is the Bible's version of the 300 story. Well, I shouldn't say that because it's a totally different story. But it's literally, he has this army of all these men. God has him whittle it down to only 300 men. And by this sign, it's kind of a weird sign. Like, there's certain men that were like drinking all politely, I think. Like they were at this like watering hole before the battle. And certain men were like just scooping the water and then other men were like being like dogs and being like, and so basically the men that were like being like dogs were like wild. He's like, yeah, those guys. And there was only like 300 of them.
Yeah,
So,
didn't he have
Those
like,
guys.
didn't he have like 10,000 men or something like that?
He had a ton. I don't remember what he had
It was a
before.
ridiculous number.
It was
people.
a very large.
It was like
thousands.
even if they were
Yeah.
fighting massive numbers, it was physically possible for them to win. God literally was like, no, you have too many. You can take credit for that.
Yeah.
And then it got to 300. He's like, okay, we can work with that.
The wild ones are so funny. The wild ones like dogs.
But along with Deborah, Gideon is kind of portrayed as the most important spiritual leader during this time. The people were worshiping Baal, a popular Canaanite god. Baal wasn't really a name, it was a title. But there were many Baals, but probably Hadad. But anyway, I won't get into the technicals on that. The point is they're worshiping Baal, the Baals probably, and Gideon comes in and says, no. And so they even give him this name that basically means something like enemy of Baal or something like that. He breaks down the idols and he reinstitutes worship of Yahweh in the areas.
Is it okay if I throw a little of that story? Because that story's kind of cool.
Yeah, go ahead. He's in the north. That's the other thing, because these two are in the north.
Okay, so
With the
if I remember
stars.
correctly, Gideon was threshing wheat, right? He was in the threshing floor. Is that correct?
I think so.
Okay, yeah, so he was hiding, basically. He was hiding because they had taken a whole bunch of the grain, and he was hiding. He was basically making flour. But he was hiding. And then God calls him. He's like, who am I? I'm like the least of the least. And God's like, nope. This is, and he basically tells him, like, he's mighty. Like, that's not who I say you are.
Right.
And then, so God tells him, his dad was basically a priest. And he had a altar. And what's called an Asherah pole, which is meant to be like an idol, right? That like inhabits and powers the altar.
Yeah, Asherah was the name of the wife of Baal. So,
Right. Okay. So there was
one of the
basically an
goddesses.
idol for Asherah, and then an altar next to it. And God tells Gideon to destroy it, and he's like, "Oh, really?" It's like, I'm gonna die if I do this. Like the whole town will kill me. And God's like, no, you need to do it. So he's like, okay. And it says he was scared, so he did it at night. So he goes in at night and he destroys this thing. And then he uses the Asherah pole. He cuts it up and uses it as wood for a fire for a sacrifice to God. So he uses their own idol for the wood.
Right.
That's epic.
And then they come in the morning and all the people are like, who destroyed our Asherah pole? What happened here? And then they go to his dad and they're like, we heard that it's your son. We need to kill him. And then his dad defends him and is like, let the God defend themselves. If they're really a God, right? He did what was right, and obviously the God didn't defend itself, so it's kind of like protected from death.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. It's a really cool story.
Yeah, Gideon's a cool dude.
The interesting thing about Gideon, so he's this great leader. He does many great things, and he's not kind of like Deborah. He rallies many of the tribes. I don't think all of them, but the greater the judge, the more tribes get involved in that judge's leadership.
Mm-hmm.
He was from Manasseh, so he was in the north. But when he was after he did all the great things for them, if you look at the bottom, it says Judges 8, the Judges 8 verse. It says, then the men of Israel said to Gideon, rule over us. both you and your son, also your son's son, for you have freed us from the hand of Midian. But Gideon said to them, I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. Yahweh shall rule over you. So Gideon understood that even though he was used by God to be this great leader, God is the king. Yahweh is the king. He's supposed to be the king of Israel. He's the rightful king. So Gideon refused the kingship. However, after Gideon dies, we learn that his son did not. So Gideon had this son. If you see in the Gideon column under Israel's enemies, it says Abimelech. Abimelech was not from Midian. He was Gideon's son. And Abimelech means my father is king. So pretty on the nose there. That everybody's wanted to and treated Gideon like a king. And so...
But Gideon named him that.
Well, we don't know that for sure. But possibly. Yeah. That is an interesting... Yeah, I mean...
It's also possible the people named them, because sometimes things like that happen.
There were times where people took a new name. So, but...
Oh yeah, because Saul turned to Paul.
Yes. But Abimelech, the important thing about him is he was very happy to accept the title of King of Israel. He wanted to be King of Israel. And so he kills all his brothers. He had a ton, because Gideon got busy. He had a lot of kids. I think he had like 70 or something. I don't know. He had a lot of kids. I forget the exact amount, but he probably had more than one wife.
Gideon,
It's not busy. It's not even fun.
he created a tribe.
From the same woman?
No, there's no way.
No.
That would be physically impossible.
I'd have to go back and read the exact.
Even if it was like
I put the
20
passage
onward
here
till
for
you
guys.
died, you're still not going to get 7 kids. Maybe in those days, I don't know what that's. Yeah, no, that's not happening.
I know sometimes
Last number.
I try to go as in depth as I can with these, but I'm also trying to do the bird's eye thing because since we're going through the whole Bible, so
Isn't the max like 15
But-
that a woman's had?
No more. I think
No,
like,
there's like a Mormon family that had like 20.
yeah,
Of her own-
19 kids in
Of her own
counting.
kid?
19 and counting, actually.
Yeah, actually, I think
she's
she
on
had-
22 now.
Oh.
Okay, yeah, I was
How
about
old
to
is she, like
say.
45?
No, she's like a little bit younger than me.
Is she?
She's
She's
had
like
back to back. She's had
Dude,
kids.
her-
You gotta start young.
Her
Yeah.
placenta
If you're
is
gonna have that
like
many, you
is
gotta
like
start,
She's
like,
had
Chuck
kids
Norris.
since she was
Fertile.
like 16.
She has Chuck
or
Norris for her
17.
placenta.
She's
Not
Chuck
bad.
Norris.
Like every year she would have a kid.
Isn't that illegal to have
I mean, I
sex?
wonder like
Okay,
what's
sure.
the most like a woman is capable
Oh,
of
that's in
having.
California law.
They're in Utah.
It's like 16 and up over there.
Yeah, they got married at 16.
Yeah.
And then he turned around and left her.
Wow, that's crazy.
So wait,
Again,
what did you
Hopefully
say?
some were twins or something.
What did you say?
It was a woman in Africa that had about 50 kids by the same husband, and then he left her. And she started off really poor and worked her way up, but she had 50 kids.
Well, at that point, you turn your kids into workers.
Well,
Yeah,
look
they
at
gotta
Nick
work the farm.
Cannon.
Yeah,
I
why
mean,
don't
he's
you
got
go to
how
the
many
city?
children?
Like, all right.
Start your own tribe.
Start your own
Nick
nation.
Cannon has like
Wonder,
7 kids
like,
from 7 different women. That guy does not stop. Nick Cannon.
No, he's at like 11 or 12 now, I think.
Oh, is that really?
Yeah, he's going.
Yeah, he won't stop. Every single
gonna
one
have his own
he meets,
tribes.
he's yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
He said something like, "Oh, I should get a vasectomy or something," and then like the next month he announced a new pregnancy, and it's like, well, okay.
They need to be-
You're not wrong,
Yeah.
but
My mind would go berserk.
So I just looked it up to verify because I thought it was 70. It is 70. So other than Abimelech, there were 70 other children of Gideon. It doesn't-
69 brothers and sisters.
I don't think
Yo.
it specifies. I'd have to go back and read it. The women, it doesn't give their names. I don't think.
All 70
Um,
women.
The bottom line is, I highly doubt it was only one woman. I don't know.
We're gonna read all 70 names.
No, we're not gonna do that. But the point is, okay, let's bring it back to the story. Got a little carried away with the sons of Gideon.
Well, I mean, how many people in the Bible have seven children? It's not very many. Might only be Gideon,
A
actually.
little bit of Jessica in my life.
It's probably true that all the Israelite women in the land wanted a piece of Gideon, and a lot of them got it. So that's just the truth of
On
it.
my max, but I wouldn't go above 70.
Yeah.
That's just insane.
It is insane. So Abimelech has these 70 other brothers, probably half brothers too. He brings them all together and he kills all of them. Kills all his brothers, all 70 of them.
Well, there could be sisters too, so he
Well,
doesn't kill those,
You
right?
wouldn't need to.
I don't know, but
Yeah.
neither here nor there. For the
It
point.
doesn't matter, yeah.
The point is, he kills all his brothers and he asserts himself as king over Israel. And not all the tribes accept this, but his tribe, Manasseh, and others do accept this. So Abimelech, technically, is the first king of Israel, but he's illegitimate. He's never recognized by all of Israel as being the true king.
Or God.
Or by God. Most important of all, he's not recognized by God. And he's portrayed in the story as a villain, a man who kills his own brothers, 70 of them. You know, Cain killed one brother, Abel, but he killed 70 brothers.
Oh my god.
Think about that, yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Jeez.
That's crazy.
this little section, I tried to draw a map for you. I'll have a bigger one next week. But I just want to show you. See this place called Shechem right here. Shechem, I mentioned it last week. It was where Joshua had got all the tribes of Israel together to reaffirm their covenant with Yahweh, that they'd only worship him. Well, after this, it became kind of a political capital in the north. So in the tribes of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh, it was like that was their capital over in Shechem. And so at this time, remember, there was no Jerusalem at this time. Jerusalem's all the way down here. It was called Jebus. It was not fully controlled by the Israelites. Shechem was. So Abimelech set up his capital here at Shechem, in the territory of Manasseh, and also Ephraim's in there too. As a short side comment, just because I thought it would be important to mention, remember how Yahweh had that tent? Whatever happened to that tabernacle of Yahweh? So I thought I would mention it. Well, remember, it wandered in the wilderness with the Israelites for the 40 years. And then when they crossed into the promised land, the ark led the way, and then the Israelites set up their first camp at this place called Gilgal. So they set up the tent there at first. But then they moved it during this period of the Judges. Actually, no, it's not during the Judges. Well, Joshua was still alive. They moved it from Gilgal to another capital called Shiloh. And Shiloh becomes what Jerusalem will be in the future, because there is no Jerusalem right now. Shiloh is the holy city. And it's the place where they set up God's tent. All the priests, the high priests, they do the ministry there. Of course, clearly they fell into paganism, and so they did things they weren't supposed to do there too. But this is where Yahweh's tent was, at Shiloh. We're going to come back to that when we talk about what happens with Eli and Samuel, the last two judges there, because a huge tragedy is going to happen at Shiloh, but also something that's cool in terms of proving that God is king. So yeah, I just want to show, oh, Bethel's over here too, in case you're curious where Bethel was. So Bethel, Shiloh, and Shechem are all kind of holy cities in the north, but they're associated with Ephraim and Manasseh. Later, David, who's from Judah, is going to conquer Jebus and rename it Jerusalem, and that's when Jerusalem is going to become the poppin', place that we still think of Jerusalem as the holy capital today. But right now, that's not
Jericho there.
Oh, I just wanted to show you where things are. So this is Jericho. They conquered Jericho from Gilgal. I'm just showing you where things are. So I'm going to try to draw a map next week, because maps are fun. So Abimelech has his capital here at Shechem. Not all the Israelites recognize him as king. Probably the majority, I would say, don't recognize him. But he's accepted by Manasseh at first. But then he starts being very corrupt. Bad things are happening with him and his Sanhedrin. So his own tribe starts rejecting him, basically. There's this civil war, and basically he's overthrown. And in the process of him trying to get away, because they're taking over the other people from his own tribe, are kicking him out of the city of Shechem, he's trying to run away, and this woman is up on this high tower with a big old rock. And so she tosses it out, hits him in the head, not completely bashes his brains out, because he was still conscious. So somehow it mangles him enough to where he knows he's dying, so he's on the ground. And then there's another soldier passing by, and he says, "Please kill me, because I don't want it to be said that I was killed by a woman." And so the other soldier says, okay, and so he kills him with the sword. And that's the end of Abimelech. and also the tragic end of all of Gideon's descendants
Oh
because
yeah, that sucks.
he killed all of them. So, but yeah,
So Gideon was cool.
Gideon was cool, but he understood
And
the lesson of the story, in case you're wondering, is what you probably already know: God is king. God
You
is
also
king.
can't father that many kids and be that involved in their lives to raise good children.
That's another great one. I didn't even think about that. That's
They're basically strangers.
that is 100% true. If you have too many children and if
it's
you
your
use
yearly
multiple women,
visit. What's up?
Yeah. Which one are you again?
How's it going? I don't even remember your name or your face.
Yeah. That even happened with, Israel, the man, Jacob, only had 12 sons, right? And we saw the conflict that happened with them
Yeah.
just from that. So, yeah, this is why one man, one woman. In case you're ever wondering, this is why. This is why. That's a great moral of the story, actually. Because otherwise, Abimelech happens. So, all right.
Let's not have more of them like.
One more
One of your
Abimelech.
sons kills the rest of them and then tries to usurp power over the country.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
how it
of
goes.
course, you're gonna make Abimelech, you know.
Yes. So then we have this guy named Tola. Some of these guys that are mentioned, they don't have as detailed of stories, so I'm just kind of glossing over them. So Tola, he's from the tribe of Issachar, another kind of obscure tribe, but just showing you I'm showing that just to show you that God is using people from every tribe to be judges. It's unclear who the enemy was, possibly the Sidonians during this time, but he judges Israel. Then there's this guy named Jair. He's from the tribe of Manasseh again. It's also kind of unclear, maybe the Maonites, unclear who his enemy was. But then Jephthah, he has a bit more of a story. His tribe isn't that clear. It's either Manasseh or Gad, based on where he's living. But he fought the Philistines, the people of Ammon, and also Ephraim, because Ephraim was doing some messed up stuff. And so sometimes during this period of confederacy, when the Israelites aren't united, their government has no central authority, sometimes they fight each other because there's conflicts between their territories, which is sad.
Is
but
this the
this happened.
story of the woman that got cut in pieces?
No, that's coming.
Oh.
So I need to hurry up because... Okay, so...
It's okay, you're doing fine.
Jephthah, yeah. So Jephthah, though, the tragedy of Jephthah is that he does this vow to God. It ends up being a tragic vow. God chose him as a judge and a leader, but he's scared that he won't be able to defeat the enemy before this certain battle. And so what he does is he says, God, whatever first comes through the door, basically, I will sacrifice to you if you will give me victory in this battle.
I forgot about this story. Yeah.
And so he wins the battle, and so he's going to keep his promise to God. And so his own daughter is the first one who comes in the door. And so because of this, he must keep his vow and sacrifice his own daughter to God. Now, it's a very controversial story, and it links into a whole other thing, an interesting Bible side thing that I won't get into right now about child sacrifice. But I'll comment on two things briefly. Number one, God of Israel, the one God, forbade child sacrifice. You cannot do that. It is sin to do that. Don't do that. However, the Canaanites, it was necessary. You had to do that. And in fact, it was the most powerful type of sacrifice. Because if you sacrifice your own child, in their understanding, you could make anything happen. Like if you want to make anything happen, guaranteed, sacrifice your own child. Like that was the way they thought about it.
It's crazy.
To these other gods. So that way of thinking is obviously still in the Israelites' minds, and so Jephthah goes through with it, and he sacrifices his daughter. And it's a tragedy that's remembered in history, they say. Like all the women of Israel remember the story, and they go out to like this certain spot to like mourn for Jephthah's daughter for generations after that. Later in the future, Ezekiel will tell the people, the prophet, much later down the road, that God, because the people were deceived by these other gods, that's why they thought that God wanted these human sacrifices, but he never wanted them. It was just that the people were deceived by the false gods. But yeah, just to show you how evil those gods are, and they're not real gods. Coming from our perspective, There are these other spiritual beings that God created that are trying to get humans to worship them. But look at the depravity that they start asking for, the bloodshed that they delight in. They are sick and evil. And that is why Jesus says our war is not against flesh and blood, but against these entities that delight in this sort of evil bloodshed and stuff like that. I think the world has come a long way away from that because of what Jesus did. I think it's pretty clear. That's why the world's come so far from that. Because before, pretty standard practice. People were sacrificing their children all over the place. Here in America, the Aztecs, or was it the Aztecs? I forget who it was.
Sounds right.
I think that's right.
Certain tribes among the Native Americans did child sacrifice. It was just something you did. So anyway, so that's Jephthah, the tragedy of him. He was still a good judge, but that was like terrible what happened. Tragedy of Jephthah. After this, there's this guy named Ibzan, kind of unclear exactly who is fighting, possibly the Amorites. But some people think there's Jewish tradition that he might have been Boaz. Be hard to prove that. I mean, I don't know. I don't know where the argument comes from. I read a little bit about it. If it was Boaz, who is Boaz? We're going to talk about him when we talk about Ruth next week. So Boaz may have been a judge if he was Ibzan. And if so, then he was from the tribe of Judah. But otherwise, it indicates that he was from the tribe of Zebulun. Then there's this guy named Elon. Yes, like Elon Musk. It's surprising sometimes. You don't always know how many Bible names there are.
Yeah.
A lot of names are Bible names that people don't expect.
Yeah.
But Elon was from the tribe of Zebulun. He fought, it's kind of unclear, but it seems like he fought against the Philistines. Then you got Abdon. Unclear again, seems like he fought against the Philistines. Abdon was from Ephraim. Okay, then we have Samson, and Samson was from the tribe of Dan. I'm pretty sure everyone's pretty familiar with Samson's story. It's funny, we were just talking about Samson last night. His enemy was very clearly the Philistines, and starting with Samson's generation, maybe a little before that, like I said, it's unclear, the Philistines become the major enemy in the land because all the other Canaanites are basically mostly conquered by the Israelites or pushed to the coast. So there are still Canaanites, but they're all on the coast. If I showed you a map, like Mediterranean seas, like right here, and then all the Canaanites were pushed to the very seashore right by the sea, and then all the Israelites took over like the inland areas. But the Philistines were coming in from Greece, which is further that way, coming into the land and fighting with Israel for their land.
Oh, the Philistines are from Greece.
The Philistines are from Greece. That's what I was saying earlier.
They leave Greece. That's a nice area.
Yeah. I mean,
Bronze Age collapse.
the Bronze Age collapsed. Mycenae collapsed. Things were going crazy.
Oh,
People
really?
were dying. Yeah, it was just possibly natural stuff like weather changes. There's all these debates about what caused it. It's kind of unclear.
Interesting. That's very interesting. Yeah, because I was like, if I was in Greece, I'd be like, I'm in the better land over here.
Yeah. Well, they were from the Aegean, so it's maybe from Cyprus. They were from one of the island places associated with Mycenae and stuff like that. But they're called the Sea Peoples if you look it up in like history books. But it's the Philistines, and so they were the primary enemies from this point on until into David's time. Because you remember David fights the Philistines too. But Samson's the first major leader of the Israelites during their time under Philistine bondage. The Philistines are trying to press inward into Israelite land from the coast. They start demanding taxes from the Israelites. All these things, they're pressing them. And so Samson's story is interesting because before he's even born, there's a man, his father, named Manoah, and his wife. They can't have children. Sounds like a familiar story because it is. This is a very common theme in the Bible. And God comes and says he's going to give them a son, but he's going to be a Nazirite from birth. And a Nazirite, I think I may have mentioned it briefly, but they were these special people that set themselves apart for God, and there were like 3 things that they could not do. Number 1, cut their hair. They could never cut their hair, ever. Number 2, eat any sort of grape product. So like wine, grape juice, grapes, anything like that. Raisins. Number 3, touch anything dead. So literally, if
catastrophic.
You better hope that no dead bird falls out of the sky and lands on you, because then you broke the Nazirite vow. Interesting thing, though, in the story of Samson, which I love, It's sad, but it's also a good story. Samson breaks the last two I mentioned. So he finds this dead lion, and there's all this honey in it, and he starts like scooping out the honey and like eating it.
So
that
gross.
that broke the vow.
That's so gross.
And then
no, it's pretty nasty.
I think he also may get drunk on wine or something like that. So
I'm
that
pretty
breaks
sure
the
he
vow.
did. Yeah, yeah.
And so the
I've heard
only
that
thing that he doesn't do is he does not cut his hair. And so because of that, and because God chose him from the womb, God set him apart. In fact, remember we were talking about the angel of Yahweh or the prince of Yahweh's army? That same figure, who is, I believe, Jesus, appears to Manoah and his wife, and he's the one who says, hey, I'm choosing this son you're going to have from the womb, Samson. So he's chosen from birth, and God is so gracious to him, despite all these things. But Samson is just so selfish. There's a running phrase throughout the book of Judges, all the way throughout. It's mentioned like at least 3 times throughout the text. But it's down here at the bottom. This is the last time. This is the very last verse in Judges. It's Judges 21:25. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So Yahweh is supposed to be the king, but because the people keep rejecting him, they have no king. So they're living in anarchy, basically. Trying to have a stable government is just such a disaster. And that's kind of the theme of the whole book. But with Samson, we get a man who does what is right in his own eyes, just like all the people were doing. He's supposed to lead the people, but he's doing what's right in his own eyes. And I'm going to read this one verse I put here too. It says, see also Judges 14:1-4. Just to show that God was provident over Samson's actions despite his sinful desires. Because I just find that such an interesting part of the story. I think it applies to a lot of things in terms of how God works. If people are doing their own thing, whatever they want to do, not listening to God, not caring, God will still sovereignly work through people's own sinful desires and everything to accomplish his purposes. And that's kind of highlighted here in this Judges 14:1-4. So Samson grows up, and we learn that he has a thing for Philistine women. He likes women that are not Israelites. So he doesn't want one of these Israelite women. I don't like
It's foreign.
He wants a nice Philistine girl.
Yeah.
So it says here that Samson went down to Timnah. Timnah was a Philistine city. And eyed in Timnah a woman, one of the daughters of the Philistines. So he came back and told his father and mother, saying, I've seen a woman in Timnah, one of the daughters of the Philistines. So now get her for me as a wife. Then his father and his mother said to him,
Take him like a strand.
okay, we are on record. I will remind you.
Oh.
This is for Elizabeth, though.
Okay, good. That was a live, like
Not
a
bad.
Facebook live.
Sure, that was funny though, but just because there's truth. And truth is what's funny. Okay. Then his father and his mother said to him, is there no woman among the daughters of your kinsmen, or among all our people, that you are going to take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? And remember, circumcision was that one big thing that they held on to that distinguished them as different and set apart as God's people. Because all the other people at this time, nobody was circumcised back then. It was like, why would you want to cut the tip of your penis? Like, why would you do that? Nowadays, we know there's a lot of infections that can happen down there. There's a lot of health problems if you don't circumcise yourself. There's a whole debate about circumcision, I think. You might know more about that than me. I'm not sure. I forget. I don't know why I feel like you and I talked about it a long
it's a
time
huge
ago.
We
debate.
did at some
There's a
point.
huge debate, yeah.
Anyway, there's a debate about circumcision, but point is, as part of the covenant with Abraham, they were circumcised, and these other people are not. And so then it says, but Samson said to his father, get her for me, for she is right. She is the right one in my eyes. But get her for me, she is the right one in my eyes.
It's happening.
But his father and mother did not know that it was of Yahweh, for he was seeking a pretext against the Philistines. Some translations say an occasion and an opportunity. For at that time the Philistines were ruling over Israel. So Samson is supposed to be this great deliverer. The focus of his life is supposed to be seeking God to help deliver the people, and helping point the people back to God. Instead, he's just so into these Philistine women. This is the first one. He ends up having two. This one ends up getting killed, because basically what happens is Samson becomes an enemy of the Philistines, because they don't like him. He's an Israelite. They won't let him have his wife, and so they kill her in front of him, even though she's one of their own people. They were trying to get Samson, so Samson gets super angry and just goes into Hulk mode and just starts destroying the whole Philistine city, burning it all down to the ground.
Just one man doing that.
And basically that's Samson's story. Like Samson's just doing what feels right to him. He's like, you killed my woman, I'm going to destroy your city. But God is using that to save Israel from the Philistines. And so it's a sad story, but it's an interesting story, and that's why I wanted to read that, because God was working through Samson's.
It's like, fine.
Yeah.
You're determined to do evil. I'm gonna use it anyway.
Right. So
It's amazing.
I probably killed the point to death now, so I will move
I think
on.
it's been clarified.
It has been established. So then there's this woman, after he loses this woman from Timnah, his first wife. Delilah comes in. She never becomes his wife, but he really has it bad for her. He simps for Delilah. And she keeps asking him, what's the secret of your strength? Because she's a Philistine. She wants to help the other Philistines. And they're like, get the secret of his strength. And he keeps lying to her, telling her, because he doesn't want her to know the real secret. But then he sees that the men come in and try to capture him. And this keeps happening, but he's so, I don't know what it was. If he's just stupid or what, he was just so focused on Delilah that he keeps trying to tell her the answer to the question. And finally, he tells her the truth, that the secret to his strength is his long hair. He's not supposed to cut his hair. And then she cuts his hair when he's asleep. And the Philistines come, they tie him up, he can't get out, God took his strength away.
What an idiot.
And they poke out his eyes, they blind him. And that's significant because he did what was right in his own eyes. So God takes his eyes away. And then they lead him away to a Philistine temple where there's one of the most populated Philistine cities. They chain him up in this temple. They're all mocking him, throwing things at him, spitting on him. He's blind. He's and he basically prays to God there. And he says, I'm sorry for everything I've done. Please forgive me and return my strength just one more time so that you can have victory over your enemies. So it's finally his focus is in the right place.
Also,
because his whole experience is aligned with God's.
His hair starts growing back also. It specifically says it.
Yeah, his hair starts growing back quickly after they cut it. There's a comment about that.
And it's funny because he asked the Philistines guards, please, I'm tired. Can you set me with the strongest pillars in this building? Right? Did he say that in the Bible? So next, we'll put you to the strongest pillars to lean against. And he leans against the strongest pillars and then pushed him down.
Yeah, so he basically brings down this Philistine temple, as Daniel says. God gives him the strength back, and he breaks the pillars and the whole roof comes down, and he kills not only himself, because he dies in this as well, but he kills all the Philistines that were there mocking him, the kings and leaders, and so all the Philistines of that time. He slaughtered all of them, and so in his death, he gave the Israelites victory from the Philistines. But it's really sad.
He couldn't even see it.
Yeah.
And
somehow Samson made it into the Hall of Faith.
Yeah, he did.
Because God is a redeemer. His last moment had enough faith.
So after Samson's story, this is the last story of a judge in the book of Judges. There are two more judges I put on the chart, Eli and Samuel. We're going to talk about them when we talk about Samuel. But they are the last judges.
A judge?
What's that?
Oh yeah, it says he was a judge.
It says Eli was a judge, and it says Samuel was a judge, yeah.
That's right.
Samuel was more than just a judge.
Samuel's a super judge.
Because what's going to happen in the future is that, as you can see, no national prophet for 450 years. But in the future, Samuel is going to be the first, not just a prophet, but a prophet over the whole people of Israel. He's going to be the first one since Joshua. But he's also going to be a judge, and he's going to be a priest. So he has 3 roles all in one.
Wow.
Yeah, he's like a super prophet.
Which is what Jesus will have as well, but except with king instead of judge. But by the time of Samuel, the role of judge, the people are getting anxious. They're like, okay, we want this judge to be our king. So there was a sense even where the people are kind of wanting Samuel to be a king. We get that from what happens with his children. But again, I'll talk about that not next week, because next week is Ruth, but then we're going to talk about Samuel, the end of the Judges period, the beginning of the Kings. But yeah, they both fought the Philistines too, and I gave you their passages in the chart. Now, the end of the book of Judges, we see two stories that are just some of the most sad and grotesque, disturbing stories in the whole Bible. But the point of the stories is not to fuel disbelief in the Bible, but I feel like it's used that way a lot. But the point of it is to show what happens when God's own people reject him and do what's right in their own eyes, how bad things get. That's the point of the story. Not only are all the people corrupt, but the priesthood is also corrupt. So all these Levites were starting to do their services for gain. They're trying to get rich. They're trying to use their position to have sex with all these different women. Like these things were happening. Like they were getting corrupt. And
Do you know who I
not only that, they were helping the people do idolatry. They were setting up idols. So in this first story, I didn't even describe the story because it was just too much to fit on the page. But there's this guy named Micah, and basically he asked this Levite to be the priest of his own household. So he's trying to hire the Levite. He's like, I'm going to pay you super well, but I want you to be priest of just my house. So the Levite does it. He's like, all right, I'm hired. So he comes and he sets up the idol that the guy wants. Levites know that they're not supposed to have idols, but he's setting up the idol. And then the people of Dan, the whole tribe of Dan, something happens where they're not able to get their inheritance. So they don't have land. So the Danites come in, ravage this guy's house, take his idol, and they're like, hey, we'll pay you a lot better than him. Would you rather be priest of just one random guy in Israel, or would you rather be priest of the entire tribe of Dan? And he's like, I'd rather be priest of the whole tribe. So he just joins them, and they take the idol and set it up in Dan. And it says that literally to this day, so whenever the book of Judges was done, which was probably during the time of the kings, this corrupt priest was still the priest of the whole tribe of Dan, and they had this idol and all that. So they never fixed that based on what it says. I mean, they might. I'm sure they did probably during Hezekiah or Josiah, but anyway, probably not during David. So then the last story after this is the Israelite Civil War, is what I call it. Now there was an Israelite Civil War on a smaller scale before this, but it was not. This Israelite war involves every single tribe.
Wow.
What happens is there's another Levite, and he has a concubine, which Levites were not supposed to have. Levites are supposed to have only one wife, but this Levite has a concubine, which is like a legal sex partner who's not really your wife. So he has this concubine. He takes her on a journey, basically, to this city called Gibeah. And Gibeah is in the tribe of Benjamin, territory of Benjamin. Later, Saul, who's going to be the first official king of Israel, is going to be born in Gibeah, the same city where all these things are taking place. But before that, he's journeying in Gibeah, and he gets there and he needs a place to stay. And in those days, it's not like today, where you have homeless people. There wasn't. That wasn't. You have these people wandering, and if you found them in your city, if you're a city that is approved by God and that is righteous, you will welcome anyone else who doesn't have a home to stay with you in your home while they're traveling.
Wow.
But the idea isn't that they'll stay there. The idea is that they need somewhere to stay just temporarily. You don't know they're coming, but you see them in the town square, and you're like, oh, I see you're visiting. Would you like to stay with me? And no one's doing that. So he's literally it's like getting late, and he's just there alone in the square. This Levite.
Must be nice.
He's a Levite. He's not just any Israelite. He's one of the people that's more significant. So they're supposed to take care of the Levites. And he has his concubine. He's there with the concubine, and no one's helping him. So finally, this other guy comes who's from out of town. But he moved there. So he's a foreigner. He's not even from Benjamin. And he takes the Levite and the concubine and takes them in. And then all the other people from Benjamin come to this guy's door, bang on it, and say, "We want to have sex with that Levite." Just like in Sodom and Gomorrah, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, except different, because in Sodom and Gomorrah it's angels, in this story it's a Levite. But they're not just like want to rape anyone, they want to rape this guy who's a Levite. So they're banging on the door, demanding this Levite, and the guy who owns the house says, "Please, here, take my daughter and take my concubine, or take the Levite's concubine, rape them instead." And the people aren't listening, they're trying to get into the door. So the guy just takes the Levite's concubine, or maybe the Levite takes her, but he throws his concubine outside, and it says that these people of Benjamin, or the men, they rape her all night long to death till she dies. And it's so bad that you could see like her whole body is like brutalized, like every part of her body. And basically because of that, the Levite sees it and he's like, "This means war. Like we gotta do something about this. This is sick." And so he chops her into 12 pieces, which I know sounds brutal, but he's trying to give evidence of what happened. And he sends all the 12 pieces of her body to all the 12 tribes of Israel. And he says, "What are we going to do about this? We need to punish the people of Benjamin. Like, they need to make this right."
Dun, dun,
So
dun,
they
dun,
all
dun.
gather. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Game of Thrones.
It really is.
So I forget if it's, like I said, it's the Game of Thrones in the Bible. So they all gather. I forget if it's Shiloh or Shechem, but they all gather to this place, the Israelites, and they're like, "Yeah, we need to demand that Israelite hand over the Benjamin people." I feel like I'm being confusing now. So the Israelite council says we need to go to this Gibeah in Benjamin and demand that the people of that city hand over the men that did this. Because it wasn't all the men that did this, but it was a group of them. So they go to the city, they go to Gibeah, they surround the city and they say, "You need to hand over the men that did this." And the town says, "No, they're part of our town. We're not going to hand them over to you. Like, what are you doing? We have our own council. Like, what are you doing?" And so they say, "All right, well then we're going to war." And so they go to war. The tribe of Benjamin goes to war against all the other 11 tribes. And it's so bad. Benjamin gets beaten so bad that they're almost wiped out completely.
Why wouldn't they just give up the men? That's so stupid.
And so because of this story, Benjamin becomes the smallest tribe in the land of Israel.
It says the guy does it.
The guy does it?
Yeah, it says his concubine. So yeah.
Okay, so the Levite does
The
it.
Levite does it. Yeah.
Yeah, they're both guys.
It says he,
But,
so it's
yeah,
unclear which he it is, but it sounds like it's that guy.
Okay,
Levite.
yeah. So as a result of this civil war, this tribe of Benjamin becomes the smallest tribe. They almost go extinct. And so the way it ends is they're like, "Man, we need to save this tribe. They're our brothers." All the Israelites are saying. So they're like, "Well, we're going to try to get these women for them." And so they do all this corrupt stuff to try to get women to wives for the people of Benjamin so they can repopulate. And they end up waiting for this feast at Shiloh. And so there's this feast at Shiloh where women are coming to like worship the Lord from among the tribes of Israel. And they're like, "All right, just kidnap the women that like don't see it." So they start kidnapping women. They're like there to worship the Lord. And then they're like, "All right, here Benjamin, here's your wives." Like, because none of the people of Israel, they put a word out throughout Israel saying, "Who wants to give wives to Benjamin?" And all of them are like, "Benjamin? Oh my God, like we just like whoop their butts. Like they're gross. Like we don't want to help them." So they force Israel by kidnapping daughters at Shiloh, and they become daughters of Benjamin. And then Benjamin survives, but they survive as the smallest tribe in the land. And that's how the book of Judges ends. Happy ending, yeah.
Yeah, so would you guys want to live during the time?
No, yes.
No.
So yeah, the book of Judges is basically like Bible medieval times. It really was part of the Bronze Age collapse, so a lot of chaos is going on in the world, and it's all the darkness that makes the people want a central authority. It's the reason they're going to want a king in the future. But the moral of the story is that the people of Israel rejected God as their king, and because of that, all these bad things happened. The last line in the book is that verse that I just read. So after all the things I said, it says, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." The end of Judges. So next week we will talk about the book of Ruth, which is a story, very cool story, that happens during the time of Judges, toward the end, but still during the time, during this 450 period of Judges.